So, Arlene, I wanted to ask you to begin by reading the opening of the first story in your collection, The Loves of Her Life.
"Would you like to make love?" Stu called out to Marianne as she entered their apartment. She walked toward his office. It was mid-Saturday afternoon, and Stu was still in his purple pajamas at the computer, a mug of coffee on the cluttered desk. He had a little wet, mocha-colored stain under his lip on his beard, and his wiry gray hair stood up thinly around his bald spot. He looked at her shyly for a moment, then looked back at the computer screen. His office was a small room off the entrance foyer, the glossy hardwood floor littered with unruly piles of papers and journals. She spotted Dissent, MIT Technology Review, the Hightower Lowdown. Unframed photos of children and grandchildren lay scattered on the marble radiator cover. Marianne had just come back from a frenetic brunch with her son Billy at a bistro on Madison Avenue and hadn't yet taken off her coat. Because his wife was divorcing him, Billy was distraught. From her point of view, as an ex-social worker, Marianne had always considered her son's wife a borderline personality. From the human point of view, an outright bitch. And Marianne would have rejoiced that they were divorcing, except that Billy was distraught. She had tried to comfort him at the same time that she was urging him not to give in to his wife's outrageous demands. Lyria wanted the apartment and the country house and half of Billy's business. Only half, Marianne had asked, but Billy was deaf to her sarcasm. He put away one gray goose after another, while the poached eggs he'd ordered turned into hard yellow eyes, and he kept making throat-clearing, half-gagging sounds he'd made occasionally when he got anxious as a kid. She didn't think she'd heard those sounds in 25 years. She had joined him in a gray goose herself, trying to smooth away her edginess, and since she rarely drank, she was still tipsy. Marianne wanted either to go to the gym to work it off or try for a drop-in appointment at her hairdresser's where she would be cosseted. She could use some cosseting. But she knew how hard it was for her husband to ask for sex, even after 3 wives. Marianne was his 4th. Why was it so hard? The best Stu had come up with was fear of rejection. She didn't understand. If you were out one day, you might be in the next. But he was reluctant even to ask for all dark meat from the chirping chicken takeout place. And also, he tended to buy the first item a salesperson showed him. His timidity annoyed her. He thought he was just an easygoing, nice guy, cooperative, and many agreed with him. She had other resentments, some small. He never brought her flowers, although she adored flowers. Quote, "I buy you printer cartridges," he'd said, and flash drives. Some resentments were chasm-sized. He didn't make enough money, and what he made, he was always giving to obscure political groups working for social justice, or to one of his numerous importuning adult children, the major beneficiaries of his modest will. And he dressed badly, and called her superficial when she complained, though lately he had let her go clothes shopping with him. Clothes delighted her. a tall, slender woman with prominent cheekbones, slanted blue eyes, and dramatic silver-white hair, Marianne attracted admiration. She did a little modeling for Eileen Fisher, one of the few fashion designers whose ads occasionally featured older women. She was proud of being, hands down, the best-looking of his wives. He loved her, she knew, in part for her looks, so it wasn't fair that he criticized her for caring how he looked. And couldn't he be even a little seductive instead of asking for sex, as if he were asking for a game of tennis? In spite of it all, or perhaps because of it, she tried never to reject him when he asked. It softened her up toward him, making love, and it got him away from his computer and connected him to another human being, namely her. She tried to do it at least once a week. It didn't sound like much. She had made love 3 or 4 times a week with her first husband, who'd been younger than she and who had died 11 years ago. But now that she was 65 and Stu 70, spontaneity was difficult. She had acid reflux, and so had to stay upright for 2 or 3 hours after a meal, or else suffer burning pains in her chest. And she had to insert Vagifem, low-level estrogen tablets, in her vagina twice a week so her tissues didn't thin out. He used Viagra half an hour before sex, and because he tended to come too soon if they weren't making love often, and once a week wasn't often, he also took a dose of clomipramine, an antidepressant that had, as a side effect, retarded ejaculation. The Viagra made him feel flushed for the rest of the day, and the clomipramine made him spacey. So they usually had sex toward evening, if not at night. He didn't really come too soon. He never came until after she climaxed, but she got most of her pleasure from intercourse after she had come. An oddity, perhaps, but that was how she was. She hated remembering what sex had been like for her in her 20s, before she'd accepted herself, and when the received wisdom was that you weren't a real woman unless you came vaginally, that is, no hands. The huffing and puffing and the squeals and screams of orgasmic pleasure she had faked. And this was in the dawning age of feminism. She had heard from a neighbor, a high school teacher, that even now, freshman girls were sucking off senior boys without getting anything in return. While Stu wanted to last after she had come, it was difficult. If she told him, as he was thrusting after her orgasm, "God, this feels good," he immediately came. If she said nothing, merely looked beatific, he also came. So now, ironically, she suppressed any noises she might have made and often lied to him that she hadn't come in order to keep him at it. And if he got notice that she wanted to make love, he masturbated 10 hours before, because then he definitely lasted longer. In short, for them, making love was like running a war. Plans had to be drawn up, equipment in tip-top condition, troops deployed and coordinated meticulously. There was no room for maverick actions, lest the country end up defeated and at each other's throats. So she called to him now, "Yes, dear, that would be very nice, making love." Thank you very much.
So there's a lot that's scary in that passage.
Okay.
And I wanted to go right to the heart of it and talk about what is scary in this story as a starting point about sex. It seems there's the fear of rejection, there's the logistical planning, there's the sense that maybe intimacy is not what's being created anymore through sex. What is so scary about sex?
If you love the person that you're with, then you go there with your whole self, or you hope to be there with your whole self. So it's a very vulnerable position to be in. And men worry, will they get an erection? Will the erection last? So there's a performance aspect, and women worry, will they come? Will they lubricate? Despite the KY jelly that you have to have, it's both the performance and then the caring about another person and not wanting to injure him and not wanting to look bad oneself. It's a complex interaction. You know, are you clean enough? Many people shower just before. Are you going to fart during the act? What can happen? And anything can happen. And if you don't love the person, then that's a misery, an additional misery. So if you love the person, it's just a little scary, but it's also wonderful. Don't get me wrong. But there are all these parameters.
And it seems like in the context of this story, Marianne may have some doubts about the relationship, not doubts in the way we usually talk about, do I stay with this person, do I not? They're together. But she has trouble feeling totally intimate with her husband, it seems to me. How does sex play into that for that character?
About trouble being totally intimate, I think everyone has trouble being totally intimate. Even in a moment of orgasm, I mean, I always remember Hemingway in For Whom the Bell Tolls. Maria has an orgasm and the earth moved under her. And I remember, I always thought, what part of the world is she in? So, I guess what I'm saying is that one is functional. There's a part of you that's alive through most things. So to have mixed feelings about your partner, there's no one in the world one doesn't have mixed feelings about. So there's always some misgivings. And how does that affect intimacy? Well, I think of forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. You need to have some sense you're flawed and your partner's flawed, and you go ahead with all your misgivings, and you hope there's enough love to make the balance go that way.
There's a stereotype that is pervasive, which is that older people or married people in general don't have sex. And did you want to kind of take that on? Because that is such a funny idea we all live with, and it seems to me that it won't die. Where the truth is, sex continues, but the nature of sex itself changes.
I didn't want to take it on. I didn't think I was taking anything on. I was just writing about what interested me and writing the best I could. It was quite a surprise when the reviews started coming in, and people focused on the first story and the last story, on the fact that I was writing about sex between people who were old. I guess 65, 70, 75, 80 is old. as if this were a revelation. It was a revelation for me. And I was asked again and again, was I trying to fill a gap in the literature? And in fact, if you go to the movies, everything's written about people, all the movies are about people in their 20s or 30s. It's boring, you know? I mean, unless you're in your 20s and 30s. But even then, you might want to travel, see what's going on in other parts of the world. So it's true that there's a gap in the literature, but I didn't have an axe to grind. I wasn't trying to do something. This was just what interested me. I'm 74. What interests me is what's happening to people my own age. I think everyone is very self-centered in that way. So I was writing these stories. But and the idea that married people don't have sex and that old people don't have sex is, every child wants to think that nothing goes on that he or she is excluded from. And I think you want to have that feeling because you know so much goes on that you're excluded from. And also you have your own wishes when you're 3, 4, and 5 to do whatever's going on in there between your mommy and daddy, to do it with your mommy or daddy. And those have to get pressed down very hard. That's why adolescence is so hard. You're giving up the attachment to your parents and trying to form attachments with people your own age out in the world. So you go from finding your parents wonderful when you're 3, 4, and 5 to finding them disgusting when you're 15, 16, 17. You need to find them disgusting to push back. And I think one of the problems is that old people identify with the way they saw their parents when they were children, or the way their children see them, and think they're disgusting, or think they shouldn't be doing this. Is it all right to do this? You see, if you read AARP magazine, so many people write in, I'm 70, is it all right to have sex? I mean, it's a bizarre question, but I think in the culture, it's like there's something wrong with it. Like a dangerous pregnancy in your 50s is to have sex in your 70s. So it's a bunch of responses to what you asked.
Well, I think that one, passion and the idea of passion is so linked in our minds to sex. And I think no matter what kind of relationship we're in, it's this idea that if you can't have this spontaneous explosion of passion, and if that's not what instigates sex in every instance, then something's off and something's not quite right. And I think as a person in my 20s, one experience I had while reading the first story in your book, and many stories in your book, was, right, this actually feels very true to life because it's not always about that touch on the shoulder, that look, and then fade out, wake up the next day with the sheets rumpled. There are a lot of logistics, both physical and emotional, that go into sex. And that's sort of one thing that it seems almost taboo to hear you read about the planning that goes into it. And yet, in a way, that's the most straightforward thing in the world. It's funny how taboo works that way.
Yeah, I think in one's 20s, one is not really flopping into it or falling. You have a million things going on in your head. Will I get pregnant? How do my breasts look? Do I like this man? Does he like me?
Could I have sex with him for the next 40 years? What would that even mean?
Can I make it through the night? Am I going to stay here afterwards, or am I going to run out of here? I mean, there's all those things going on at all ages.
Yeah, doesn't go away, but changes, which seems fair enough. Yeah. So I want to talk about. I want to talk about a story in your book, The Love of Her Life. I'm sorry. In Love with Murray.
In Love with Murray.
In Love with Murray. This story is about a young painter whose name is Lita, who's in her early 20s. It's set in the late 60s. And she meets and falls in love with an older painter who's accomplished and known, who's married, and they have a really profound love affair between the two of them. And you dedicate your story to Bernard Malamud, who was your teacher and who you had an affair with. And I want to ask you first, what it was like to write this story.
That story comes out of a novel that I wrote and couldn't get published. I have lots of things that I couldn't get published, as anybody who writes and sends things out knows. Okay. And then I thought, well, I will cannibalize that novel. And I pulled 2 stories out of it. One of them was In Love with Murray. The other story was Night Call. You'll see when you read the book, they don't seem connected at all. But in fact, the OBGYN, the doctor whose father has died, in the novel is the husband of Lita when she's in her 30s or 40s. But I don't think there's any way in the book of short stories to tell they're connected. So, to go to your question, what was it like to write that story? I wanted to get in something that in some way touched on my relationship with Bernard Malamud, because it was a very precious relationship to me. I had an affair with him for 2 years, and then we were friends for the next 25 until he died. So it was a relationship you have 27 years is going to be very important. So I wanted to get something in about that. And I think that story, it gave me a lot of pleasure. I felt I owed that to him. And I actually did some direct quotes from him. There's a wonderful biography of Bernard Malamud by Philip Davis, who's British, and it's called Bernard Malamud, A Writer's Life. And he has several chapters about my relationship with Malamud. And there are little notes that I got from him and little letters, and I pulled some of those things directly out and used them. Now, the story it has some autobiography in it, but it's not autobiographical in total. I mean, nothing one writes is autobiographical in total unless it's very, very thin stuff. You know, it's not a diary. In fact, in this story, they're both painters, and he dies in his early 50s, and that's the way the affair ends after 2 years. And she's 21, and that's not what happened in life at all. But there was enough of him in it. I wanted to do him honor, and I felt that it did him honor. So I'm pleased with that story.
Yeah, one thing I would say that is so moving and surprising about that story is that it feels like a real love story. It's not a story where the tables turn and something turns ugly. There is a breakup and there is emotional trouble between them, but it's not a story where it's revealed that this sentimental connection between these two people is actually false or is based on manipulation or a lie. And it strikes me that's very rare in that kind of story. It's a very rare power dynamic to portray.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, I wanted to read, to give the audience a sense of what I mean, a couple of sentences from it, which I find really wonderful, and which I think also relate to the first story you read about one's 20s. And you write, despite the 28-year difference in their ages, she turned out to have had more sexual partners. He had married early and had had children early and had made love with only 5 women in his life, and only one at a time, and he was curious and impassioned and grateful to her in his shyly arrogant way, claiming that in his late 40s, she'd restored his youth to him. So there's something really wonderful there and true. It strikes me that both characters in this story are vulnerable, deeply vulnerable, each in their own ways. Was there a moment when you felt like it was the right time for you to explore that particular vulnerability in writing about this?
I think every character in that book is vulnerable. And I'm vulnerable. And when you write, it's like when you love someone. You're out there with everything, and you're worried you're going to be rejected, that the writing will be no good, that you won't be loved, and one is so grateful to be loved. So I think as I get older, I'm able to be more vulnerable and able to recognize that the people I'm with are vulnerable too. So I don't know if there came a moment, if I used to be closed down. I don't think I was ever especially closed down, but I feel more solid. And if you feel more solid, you could be more vulnerable. Mm-hmm. So I don't know how to answer the question. I may have answered the question.
I think you did. And it reminds me, and we were talking a little bit earlier before the program about your story Dancing, which is a beautiful story and is about a family, a wife, a husband, and their teenage son, whose life is shattered by the husband's diagnosis with cancer. And this happens around the time of September 11th. There's a lot going on. And you tell the story from different perspectives. We have the son's perspective, we have the wife's perspective, we have the husband's perspective. What made you decide to tell the story that way, with those different points of view?
I want to back up for one moment. Please. Because I remembered something I was going to say about the In Love with Murray story that left me. If you're sitting talking in front of many people, things leave you. Which is that Terry Gross interviewed me on NPR, Fresh Air, and she hammered away at my relationship with Bernard Malamud. She didn't really in the interview, because it went on for an hour and a half, but what the editors did was they cut it down to half an hour, which was just about my relationship with Bernard Malamud. That's what it was mostly about. So it was surprising when I listened to it. I still thought it was pretty good. I don't have any complaints, really. But I felt that underlying a whole number of her questions was the belief she had that if a young woman has an affair with an older celebrity, a famous, respected artist, it's got to be bad for the young woman. And it just wasn't. So I couldn't tell her, yeah, it was bad. I couldn't do it at all. So I guess this speaks to, you asked about being vulnerable. Mm-hmm. I could see she wanted to push me into some cliched response, but it just wasn't there.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, there's as a reader of that story, you sort of expect almost like the David Mamet Oleana, where perspectives shift and you realize that something really bad has happened or that the young woman is really injured. Whereas that doesn't happen, and it's more complicated in your story than that. And it's true, reading the story now, certainly the way that colleges are now and the way that relationships are really much more codified in that way, that it's really, not only is it discouraged, but often it is simply not allowed in a university setting to have an affair with a former student while they're still enrolled. It's very, often for very good reasons. And yet, this is the emotional experience that defies what often happens, because people, I think, often do feel hurt or manipulated by these kinds of relationships, and that's a very troubling and complicated thing as well. And yet, what really is the heart of the emotional conflict, as I see it in the story, separate from your life, is the sense of a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. And this is a major moment in her life. but they both know that their future is not a shared one. What do? You can live in this paradise moment together, protected, and they do. They have their meetings at her apartment, which is kind of like a neutral space, but it's not a shared life. It's a moment that they both share, but you know that it can't turn out to be a life together. Tragic in a way, and also beautiful, as a lot of things are, a mixed experience.
Human life defies the party lines. It's certainly between an analyst and a patient. An analyst should not touch, and I don't mean a friendly pat on the back once, but should not have sex with a patient. That I would say absolutely. But even then I know occasionally an analyst marries a patient and lives happily ever after. But on the whole, if an analyst goes near you, get out of there. But in the world at large, everything is complicated. Right? All right, let me move back.
Well, let me switch.
Switch.
I'm deleting that previous question. If someone wants to bring it up in Q&A, great. But I have a more interesting one now.
Go.
Based on what you just said, which is, so you've been a practicing psychoanalyst for your whole adult life, pretty much.
Sure.
And how does that inform your fiction writing? It strikes me that the two do have a lot to do with one another, looking into the human heart, the human mind, motives, the past. How do they inform one another for you?
Well, I never use anything that I hear from a patient in a piece of fiction. I really think you have to keep a lead shield up between what you write and your practice, because patients come for help and they don't come to be put in stories. Also, the process of writing is very different from the process of seeing a patient. When you write, you start with a blank page or screen, and there's nothing fucking on it at all. So it's terrifying. And you've got to get something on there out of yourself. And you start with so little. You might have an idea of somebody you met, or a little wisp, something about a character, and you have to create, get all the mud out of yourself and shape it into a human being, and then shape a story. When you see a patient, it's very different. A person comes in who's so complicated, and there's so much there that you can't get all of it, and you have to look at what's coming at you and simplify it. So at the same time that you appreciate the totality of it, you have to simplify to be able to understand what the person's complaining of, and how can you help that person. You really have to take it down to a skeleton, and it takes a while to be able to see how the past is connected to the present, to the person's present problems, how the person's reacting to you, how you're reacting to that person. You have this wealth of information, and you have to boil it down so you could say something useful to the person. They're really two very different processes, being a psychoanalyst and being a writer. They have certain things in common. What they have in common is you have to have an intense interest in human beings, it seems to me, to do both of those professions. And also you have to be able to say things that are hard to say with a patient while being tactful. You try to be tactful. When you're writing, you're not so tactful. You worry that you're going to horrify people, so there's an internal taboo. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is there are different concerns in both, but it is an ethical responsibility not to write fiction about patients. Even if you write a professional paper, you disguise the patient, and this is to help people treat people better. as professionals. You disguise the patient, you show the patient the paper, you ask permission of the patient. In fiction, there's no excuse, from my point of view, for ever using anything that you hear in the consulting room.
Mm-hmm. All right, we're going to go to audience questions. Who has questions? And how should we...
So we'll come around with the microphones.
Okay.
If you can raise your hands.
Okay, so the microphone is coming.
So we will start with this woman right here.
Continuing what you were just discussing, in psychoanalysis, it seems to me there are prescribed diagnoses that you possibly are trying to link.
Could you stand up? I can't see where, oh, thank you.
In psychoanalysis, you've got your different personality disorders that you're trying to see, does this person have this, does this, well, how much of this is this? You're fitting your patient to known symptoms possibly and prognosis and treatment, where in fiction, you're doing the exact opposite. You're taking a stick figure and applying personality traits to it. How do you not inadvertently use the life of a patient in the creation of a character? Do you understand the question?
I'm not sure I understand how the first part of what you said is connected to the question. Maybe I didn't understand the first part of what you said. So
well, I'm
would you
looking at
repeat it? I'd be
I guess
grateful.
I'm seeing it as at one point you're starting at A and going to B, and in the other you're taking B and going to A. Is that more clear?
I think we
You're
just did,
starting
I think
with
we
a
did just
person.
discuss this.
You're starting with a person,
Yeah.
and you're taking that person and you're breaking it down into things that are known, scientific, I want to say labels, or personality disorders.
Okay, I
things
think-
you're treating.
I have an idea. You want to know how one would not use material from patients.
I'm not talking about specifics, but you're using the traits of your characters. Your fiction is realistic. You've done a beautiful job of filling out these characters that they're people we recognize. Certainly your experiences hearing the incidents that go on in the relationships with people, disordered or not disordered, have to become part of the ultimate character.
All I can say is that I don't find, it's a rare thing that I have a thought, oh, that would make a good story. I just never think that at all. And one is more interested in working out one's own conflicts in fiction than you are with other people. Also, I think one big difference is you're trying to help somebody fix herself or himself in the way he wants. When you write fiction, you're not trying to improve your characters in any way. So it's not important to understand how their childhood impacts their current life at all. You just create them whole, and you don't think about the influence of their child. You want vividness, you want life, and that's what you create. It just seems to be so different that my patients are not in danger.
Okay, who else has questions? In the front,
In the
yes, coming to you with the mic.
Going back to the Bernard Malamud, I'm interested to know the ending of the affair and the transition into friendship. What was relevant and what held on to sustain the friendship?
You mean in my life,
Yeah,
as
yes,
opposed to
yes,
in the
yes,
piece of
yes.
fiction?
And it would apply in the transition of relationships from the affair to from love or that emotional moment into something that endured.
So really it's a question about how can you end an affair?
Well, and how the realities, it ends, what causes that to end? what's your insight into ending, and what's your insight into transition, as it would apply not only personally, but as you would then talk to someone else, of your understanding of that what happens in life, the realities of what happened, how it transitions.
I can only answer in specific because one can't generalize about these things. I really recommend this wonderful biography by Philip Davis, Bernard Malamud, A Writer's Life. It's really beautiful. But what happened, I was 21. I was starting a Fulbright in Spain. I met Bern in Italy. We spent some time together. And I was interested in young men. I was just looking around, and he felt in some way that that I was interested in other men. Nothing happened. I didn't take off with somebody at all. But he was a very sensitive man and recognized that. And he went back to the United States, and I went on to Madrid, where I spent the year. And he said he wouldn't be writing me for a year. No, he just said he wouldn't be writing for a while. But what happened was there was so much we shared as people. And he was a writer. I wanted to be a writer. I went over all of his work. He went over all of my work. And we had a real affection for each other. So when I came back to the United States, one of us got hold of the other of us, and we just went on being friends. He recognized that I couldn't go on with this for a lifetime. I wanted to marry and have children, and he wanted that for me. And he held one of the poles of the chuppah at my wedding. Chuppah is for people who are not Jewish, and it's kind of a sheet with 4 poles that you have important people hold those poles at your wedding, and you stand under it with the groom. So that's what happened in that instance. I have another friend, a man that I had an affair with, and again, it went on for a while, and then you go one way, he goes another way. But there's enough holding you together so you want to keep seeing each other. There's enough of a friendship. So I guess that's my answer.
Thank you.
And there's respect for both people and a wish not to damage each other.
Questions? Okay.
Hi, thank you for your sharing and the stories. A colleague of mine whose mom's husband just passed away a few months ago. She's in her mid-60s, and she's just been through this very painful moment. And at the same time, she's also looking for new relationship. And at the same time, she feels the word she described dust off. I'm the mom of 2 kids. Am I going to look attractive to another man? Am I going to have another relationship again? So I feel like this society doesn't provide a lot of support for seniors, especially when they went through this sorrow moment and looking for a new relationship. So a group of people in my age, I know it sounds probably naive, but we were looking for opportunities to maybe provide more information for people with such needs, and maybe start with community centers where people would go there, spend their time and learn information. But I'm not sure that if it's going to be silly that we, in this age, like in my 30s, my question is, do you think it's gonna be a effective way to help seniors, or it's just something that sounds pretty naive?
The way you propose to help seniors is having at community centers providing a place they can meet each other, or giving talks about it. Sounds good to me.
Maybe you should give her a copy of Arlene's book.
Oh,
Also.
that's a good idea. But no, seriously, anything that provides people with a way to connect, to be around other people, because one's opportunities of meeting people are limited. That's one of the wonderful things about the internet. You can meet people. There are chat groups of widows, for instance, and you can get on and see what's going on, because people feel guilty also going out with people after a spouse has died. And if you have a lot of other people feeling guilty too, then you stop feeling so guilty. So I just saw a wonderful line from Mark Twain about to live the ideal life, you need good books, good companions, and a sleepy conscience. And one really feels as if one should be faithful to the dead spouse. But even the marriage vows just say, until death shall we part. So any opportunities, that's good. There's a question up here.
There's a question in the
Hey,
back.
Arlene.
Oh, back
Hey,
here.
How
Okay.
you doing? All right. So my question was, how exactly does your collection of short stories relate to speed, which was the overall topic of the festival? Like, I understand, like, the first one was about, like, planning, like, and being, like, putting in forethought before you have sex, like, when you're, like, older. But how do, like, the rest of the stories relate to that?
Could you repeat that question?
Yeah,
Did
and
you
actually,
hear?
I'm going to co-opt that question a little bit because this was my original planned last question.
Could you repeat it,
I will
though, for
repeat
me,
it.
so
The
I hear it?
Absolutely. The question is, how does your book of short stories relate to the topic of the Chicago Humanities Festival, which this year is speed? And I had wanted to...
You take it.
Well, I had...
You take it, and I'll think while you're speaking.
Okay, well, one thing I will say, and then I'm going to offer a partial response, then I'm going to actually ask the author. But one thing I will say is that Allison had mentioned to me before that speed can also mean slowing down. And that hadn't even really occurred to me. But I think that's very true, that speed, as we saw in the first story, can mean slowing down, taking one's time. And I had wanted to ask you, on the subject of speed, you've become a published author for the first time in your 70s after having a full career as a psychoanalyst, in fact, while continuing to have it. And some might consider this to be a slower path, and certainly not for lack of trying, as you've said, but now you're having this wonderful moment, and I had been curious about what it feels like to be a published author now at this moment in your life.
It feels wonderful.
Good.
And in response to the topic speed, I listen carefully, and I want to listen carefully. And when you write, you rewrite each sentence so many times, and every word matters. I can't speed read. I took a course and tried, but I can't do it. It may be that reading things where the words don't matter, you can just speed through that because style doesn't make any difference. But constitutionally, I look over the whole thing, and if it's not well written, I don't want to read it, is a problem that I have. So, again, one can't generalize, but I think important times in life demand that you slow down, that you not multitask, be doing 3 things at once, because you're doing nothing. And some things are worth attending to with all your being, and you can't, get it in 2-minute sound bites. If you listen to those debates, people have to keep saying the same things again and again and again and again, and one doesn't want that in life. So you have to be slow so you can say something in a way you haven't said it before, so somebody can hear it.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our program today. I invite you to join us downstairs for the book sale, the book signing, as well as for the talk in the member lounge.
Thanks, Arlene.